There are quite a few strange stories that happen out at sea. This happened when my grandfather was still going out fishing in the old days. He had gone out to fish, but the wind started to pick up, and he thought it would be dangerous if he didn't return, so he headed for the port. Soon the rain grew heavier, turning into a thick curtain of water that made it almost impossible to see ahead. The rain was so intense it was like a wall of smoke. In the midst of hurrying back, his future wife, my grandmother, though at the time she was just a childhood friend, suddenly appeared like smoke at the bow of the boat, pointing insistently to the left, saying, that way," before disappearing. Surprised, my grandfather looked in the direction she had pointed and saw a large shadow faintly visible through the thick curtain of rain. He quickly accelerated to escape from that spot, and right behind his boat, a large ship crossed by, barely missing him. When I say accelerated, remember that at that time it was just a small boat without even an outboard motor. He said it really was a hair's breadth escape. Back then, boats didn't have the equipment they do now, and you could only check the situation of surrounding vessels by sight. If she hadn't appeared to warn me then, I would have died right there, my grandfather used to say. He said he had seen corpses in the water several times too. Whether from accidents or suicides, corpses in the water float among the waves in a pitiful state. But strangely, they seemed to approach the boat. My grandfather, being scared, would desperately row to get away, but they would still follow. In a small boat, fishing alone, he couldn't pull a corpse onto the boat, and with his livelihood at stake, he couldn't stop fishing either. At times like these, my grandfather and other old-school fishermen would apparently recite a kind of charm. It wasn't like a magic spell, though. They would put their hands together towards the corpse and say, "I'm sorry, but I need to fish now, so could you please stay away and not interfere? In return, when I'm done fishing, I'll make sure to bring you back to land no matter what." After that, the corpse would somehow drift away until it was just barely visible among the waves, floating there, neither too close nor too far. When the fishing was done, he would call out loudly to the corpse, "I'm done fishing now, so I'm heading back. Make sure you follow closely." Strangely enough, the corpse would then follow the boat back to the port, maintaining that distance. My grandfather used to say that humans must really want to return to land after all. My brother too has seen something like a ghost when he went out to sea with our grandfather. Our grandfather was the type of person whose job was fishing and whose hobby was fishing. Basically, whenever he had a moment, he'd take his boat out to fish. That day, he had taken my brother out to sea in the early afternoon. After a while, my grandfather peered over the edge of the boat into the sea and said to my brother, "There's a woman suspended in the water over there," pointing. My brother looked over the edge into the sea too, but he couldn't see where the woman my grandfather was talking about was. Grandfather reached behind him for a viewing box and looked into the water with it. A viewing box is a type of underwater viewer with a glass bottom fitted into a box-shaped structure. It's a tool used to view underwater from the boat. As grandfather peered into the water with the viewing box, he muttered, "Ah, she's gliding along, looking so lonely. Poor thing. She must be heading towards the shore." When my brother borrowed the viewing box from grandfather and looked into the water, he saw a skeletal hand that seemed to be trying to grab him. Grandfather immediately turned the boat around and called the police. The police came right away and searched the area, finding the body of a woman whose suicide note had been found a few days earlier. Of course, after only a few days, there's no way she could have become just bones. So what my brother saw remains a mystery. This is a story I heard from a relative about my grandmother, who has since passed away. It happened 60 to 70 years ago, before the war. My grandmother, who was probably around 20 years old at the time, was hospitalized to give birth to her first child. In the bed next to her was a young girl, about 10 years old, who had been in the hospital for a long time. I heard that she and my grandmother got along well. The girl was apparently hospitalized for an eating disorder or some nutritional problem, but the details are unclear now. One night, as my grandmother was lying in her hospital bed, suddenly the window opened, and a strange black creature about the size of a cat looking something like a monkey, came in. It was making a harsh, raspy croak like that of a raven as it climbed onto my grandmother's bed. Frightened, my grandmother grabbed the rosary she always kept with her and started desperately chanting Buddhist prayers. She prayed thinking, "Don't bother me or my unborn child." But whether it was due to fear or because of that creature, she couldn't raise her voice, she said. The creature kept making that harsh, raspy croak and stayed on my grandmother's bed for a while. After some time, without doing anything else and leaving nothing but fear behind, it jumped off the bed and leaped onto the bed where the long-term hospitalized girl was sleeping. It kept making that ominous, raspy croak and lingered in the hospital room. The creature apparently stayed in the room for several hours, but eventually it went out through the window and disappeared. My grandmother confirmed that the creature had left, and after watching for a while, felt a wave of exhaustion and fell asleep. The next day, the girl in the next bed had died. She had been fine the night before, with no noticeable changes, but overnight she had weakened unbelievably and passed away. During her lifetime, she told this story about the small black monster to several people. I heard this story from one of those people, my aunt. Looking back on that time, my grandmother reportedly said that it might have been the god of death. But whether it was really the god of death, some mysterious creature, or an evil spirit, we'll never know for sure. I find myself thinking, if such a creature really exists, maybe it's some kind of alien or an undiscovered species. But what do you all think? What could this small black monster be? One day, my great-grandfather went fishing together with an acquaintance, each in their own boat. It was a day that seemed likely to turn into a storm. Fish and bait are more active before a storm, making them easier to catch. As they kept catching fish, they gradually moved further out to sea. While they were absorbed in fishing, the boats drifted apart until they could no longer see each other. Suddenly, the wind strengthened and the waves quickly became rough, creating a dangerous situation. Although they had been watching the clouds while fishing, this was a weather change unlike anything they had experienced before. At that time, fishing boats were small wooden vessels without engines. My great-grandfather tried to hurry back, but he had already drifted far from the island. Then fog began to swirl around, and he lost sight of the direction of the island. Even my great-grandfather resigned himself to the possibility that this might be the end. At that moment, he saw the shadow of a large ship through the fog. He thought he was saved. If he could board that ship, everything would be fine. With that in mind, he paddled towards the ship. As the rough waves entered his small wooden boat, he bailed out water with a wooden scoop while rowing. Wooden boats of that time were equipped with wooden scoops and dippers to bail out water that came in. Fortunately, the large ship also seemed to be heading towards him. Just as my great-grandfather was about to call out for help, he noticed something. The people on the other ship had already spotted his small boat, and several figures at the ship's edge were pointing at him incessantly. The figures at the ship's edge gestured for my great-grandfather to hand over his wooden scoop. Seeing this, my great-grandfather suddenly realized something. Looking closely at the black figures at the ship's edge, he saw that they all had ashen faces as if they had drowned, with eyes that seemed to be looking at nothing. Realizing this was a ghost ship, my great-grandfather immediately broke the bottoms of all the wooden scoops and dippers on his wooden boat. He remembered a story he had heard from the island elders. If you encounter a ghost ship, the dead will take your scoops and dippers and use them to bail water into your boat, sinking it. My great-grandfather noticed his friend, who had gone fishing with him among the figures at the ship's edge. His friend also had an ashen face as if he had drowned. At that point, my great-grandfather's mind became foggy, and he couldn't remember anything after that. When he next regained consciousness, he found himself trying desperately to bail water into his own boat using the bottomless wooden scoop. Fortunately, because the bottom was broken, no water was accumulating in the boat. The dead must have made me lose my senses because they couldn't steal my scoop, my great-grandfather used to say. On the Ome Highway, just past Okutama and a bit before the well-known Uiran Buchi, there's a confluence of rivers. A tributary called Ichinos River joins the mainstream there, and for a while after that junction, it flows through what's called a gorge, more like a river running between vertical cliffs than a valley. There was this guy named Machia who mainly enjoyed mountain stream fishing. He thought, the less accessible a place is to people, the better the fishing must be. So despite warnings, he entered the river at the confluence and started fishing. But he wasn't catching anything at all. With high rock walls on both sides, it was hard to get out of the river, so he reluctantly continued upstream. The Ichinos River has several more tributaries, and one called Otsunagai Valley flows into it. It's known as a good fishing spot and popular for river climbing. But it's a treacherous place. It's called a bad valley because quite a few fatal accidents have occurred there due to falls and such. Although it was a good spot, Machia judged it too dangerous to go alone. There was also a place to enter and exit the river at this confluence, so he was thinking about moving to a different river. But for some reason, from this point on, he suddenly started catching fish, and good-sized ones at that. The river ahead became a gorge again, but he decided to continue fishing up the Ichinos River. The fishing remained excellent. Midway, there was a 10-foot waterfall, and he caught his best fish of the day there, which made him very happy. Hoping for an even bigger catch, he climbed over the waterfall. That's when he noticed someone ahead of him upstream. The person was using a bamboo rod, and their technique looked skillful at a glance. But their outfit was bizarre, a suit with business shoes and a hunting cap. Still, his fishing skills were remarkable, catching fish one after another. Usually you'd gradually move upstream and change spots, but this man in the suit kept fishing in the same place without moving at all. In mountain stream fishing, it's considered bad manners to overtake someone ahead of you. But if the person ahead isn't moving, you can ask permission to go ahead. Machia felt quite creeped out, but to ask permission to enter the upstream area, he called out, "Hello, that was a nice fish you caught just now." At that time, the man in the suit was crouching with his back to Machia, seemingly removing a hook or something. "It must be over 12 inches. You're very skilled," Machia continued, but the man remained silent, still crouching. Thinking the man might be hard of hearing, Machia moved to the man's right side to be in his field of vision. But the man turned his face away, refusing to look at Machia. However, Machia could see what the man was doing. He was stuffing fish into a glass jar for specimens. Not just one or two, but so many that the fish were losing their shape. Realizing this wasn't normal, Machia decided to avoid getting involved. He just said, "Excuse me," and passed by the man. The man kept his back turned to Machia as he moved, still refusing to show his face, but he seemed to continue stuffing fish into the jar. After walking about 33 feet, Machia looked back out of curiosity, but the man had vanished. The rock walls on both sides were nearly 33 feet high, and there was a waterfall downstream. It wasn't a place where one could easily leave the river. Later, at a drinking party with fellow anglers, Machia met a veteran angler known as the Man of Okutama. This person had explored even the tiniest streams and valleys in the area and had even written magazine columns. When Machia told him about the man in the suit, the veteran angler just mumbled, "So you saw him too?" There was a rumor about a yokai called Mr. Gnawbones at the elementary school we attended. It was more of a school ghost story than a yokai tale. When children went to the back of the school building alone, they had to say, "Pray forgive our intrusion, for we are but humble wanderers in the dark," to protect themselves. I first heard this story when I was probably in 3rd or 4th grade. There was an older girl who lived in my neighborhood, and although we were in different grades, we were good friends. Let's call her Yoko. I often went to play at her house after school, and when our dismissal times matched, we'd walk home together. It happened on a day just before summer vacation. I was walking home with Yoko, and there were a couple of other older students with us. There were also 2 girls from my class who usually walked home with me. As we were chatting noisily about something, one of the older students looked at the other 3 and said, "Should we tell these kids about it now?" I felt a mix of fear and anticipation, wondering, What could it be? But Yoko, looking at my face, said, Saya's a bit of a scaredy cat, creating an atmosphere that suggested they shouldn't tell the secret. My name is Saya, and the way Yoko said it made it seem like the other kids wouldn't get to hear the secret because I was too afraid. Thinking this wasn't right, I told Yoko, I'll be fine. The other older students looked at Yoko with a "what should we do" kind of expression. Yoko double-checked with me. Are you sure you're okay? And when I answered, yeah, I'm okay, we were allowed to hear the secret story. Do you know about the boundary story at our school? One of the older students asked. We didn't know anything about it, so we said no. The older student, thinking for a moment, said, the boundary is the line between where you can go and where you can't, between the grades that can hear about it and those that can't, and between those who have heard it and those who haven't. I started to regret a bit, feeling like this was getting scarier than I had expected. Hey, do you know why kids aren't supposed to go to the back of the school alone? The older student asked. I had never thought about it and just assumed it was forbidden because it was forbidden. It's because it's on the other side of the boundary, they said. Another older student continued, you know that small ditch right behind the school building? The one that runs straight from the wall to outside the fence? That's the boundary. If kids cross that boundary alone, they might not come back alive. Another older kid continued the story. Beyond the boundary, there's a rat monster called Mr. Gnawbones. When they said rat monster, I couldn't help but think of the mouse grandmother from a picture book I had read in kindergarten. So even though the story had been scary up to this point, I felt a bit conflicted, wondering if this was just an imitation of Grandma Mouse. One of my classmates answered with a slight laugh, that sounds kind of funny. The older student sharply retorted with a straight face, it's not funny at all. Mr. Gnawbones doesn't forgive humans who see his form. These humans might spread word of what they've seen, so if his form is seen, he hacks at them with an axe. If you swear, I solemnly swear for as long as my childhood shall last, never to speak of this to anyone before being attacked. And if he accepts this, you might be spared. The kids who had the worst experience are dead now. You have to swear you'll never talk, but one of them got scared and ran away. Then anyone would think they might talk, right? Mr. Gnawbones chased after the kid who ran and hacked at them from behind with his axe. Mr. Gnawbones is very strong, but he's small, about the size of a kindergartner. So when he strikes from behind, he hits around the waist or bottom. That kid's hip bone was split open too, and they couldn't move anymore. A heavy atmosphere settled over us. Did they die? One of my classmates asked. No, they weren't dead yet at that time. But with such a serious injury, they must have been in so much pain and near death that they couldn't swear not to tell anyone, right? We nodded silently. Then, because they were in pain and couldn't speak, just moaning, Mr. Gnawbones got really angry. He suspected that this kid was definitely planning to talk, so he stomped on the fallen child's back with all his might. Guess what happened? I involuntarily gulped. The older students continued to tell the terrifying story in a matter-of-fact tone. When he stomped down hard, thump! The intestines whizzed out like a rope from where it was hacked open. The bone was broken too, and the wound was so deep that there was a hole all the way through, and that's where it came out. That's not all. Mr. Gnawbones was still angry, so this time he stomped on the kid's head with a bam. Then the skull cracked and the face was slightly crushed. We third graders huddled together in terror. The child attacked by Mr. Gnawbones was found by the security guard late that night. But at first the guard didn't think what was lying there was human. Leaves were haphazardly covering the body. The face illuminated by the flashlight was crushed sideways with teeth sticking out, looking like a rat's face. The intestines protruding from the wound in the waist looked like a long rat's tail. There was one muddy footprint each on the child's back and head, but they weren't human footprints. They were the footprints of an incredibly large beast. No one could tell what kind of footprints they were. The other child somehow managed to get Mr. Gnawbones' forgiveness in return, but committed suicide out of guilt for being the only survivor. In the notebook left behind by this child, the events of that day and information about Mr. Gnawbones were written. It said that he first appears in the form of a cat-sized rat, so deal with him while he's still in rat form. When children go to the back of the school alone, they are to say, "Pray forgive our intrusion, for we are but humble wanderers in the dark," and pretend they can't see. The story of Mr. Gnawbones was from decades ago, soon after this school was built. Heard an unbelievable story. Just as the older students had said at the beginning about the boundary between those who have heard it and those who haven't, I had now crossed that boundary and could never return to my blissfully ignorant self. For about a week after that, I started having nightmares and was terrified of going to sleep. That summer vacation, there was a science experiment workshop at school. There were several courses, and participating children from different grades would experience them together. Both Yoko and I participated. I was in the course making a large air cannon, and Yoko was in the course making super balls. Before going home after the workshop ended, I borrowed the super ball Yoko had made, and we were playing with it, bouncing it in the second floor hallway. The super ball Yoko made wasn't a perfect sphere, but was lumpy and uneven, which made it bounce in weird directions. But that was what made it fun, so we stayed behind to play. As we were doing this, the bouncing super ball flew out of the hallway window. It had fallen behind the school. We went to find a teacher to come with us, but they were all in a faculty meeting. "What are you kids still doing here? You should have gone home by now." Yoko and I decided we had no choice but to sneak to the back of the school by ourselves to retrieve the super ball. As we made our way to the back of the school, we agreed that if Mr. Gnawbones appeared, we'd desperately swear to keep his secret, promising never to tell a soul. We called out, "Pray forgive our intrusion, for we are but humble wanderers in the dark," as we stepped over the boundary ditch and cautiously entered the other side. I was so nervous that my knees felt weak and were shaking a little. Behind the school building, there was a place where fallen leaves were gathered, unused boards were piled up, and weeds were growing in patches. We used the open second floor window as a landmark and searched the area below, but we couldn't find the super ball. Yoko suggested, "Maybe it went under there," and we started lifting the corrugated metal sheets and plywood boards leaning against the wall. At that moment, a large rat leapt out from the gap. It was an enormous rat, as big as a cat. I was so startled that I let out a yelp and collapsed on the spot, but Yoko quickly grabbed a stick lying nearby and started chasing the big rat. She called out to me, "Hurry up, Saya!" That's right, I remembered. The command left in the notebook flashed through my mind. Deal with Mr. Gnawbones while he's still in rat form. As if jolted by an electric current, I snatched up a stick and dashed after Yoko. The big rat wasn't running, but hopping along the school building as it fled. Yoko and I chased after it, occasionally trying to hit it with our sticks, but we kept missing and hitting the ground instead. It was hard to aim at the hopping rat. Plus, I was scared of the idea of beating a big rat to death with a stick, so I was swinging timidly and missing by quite a bit. Yoko was probably the same, and we were both squealing in fear as we swung our sticks around. As we chased the big rat, we reached a point where the school building turned at a right angle. Perhaps thinking it was a dead end, the big rat suddenly turned towards us and lunged at Yoko's feet. Both Yoko and I screamed and fell on our bottoms. The rat jumped right past us and hopped back the way it came. "This is bad! This is bad! This is bad! We have to hurry before it turns into Mr. Gnawbones." Yoko and I got up and chased after the big rat again. It scurried back to where it was first hiding, behind the corrugated metal sheets and plywood boards. Yoko and I cautiously approached the area with the metal sheets. That's when it happened. The stacked metal sheets and plywood boards suddenly started rattling and shaking violently, as if they were about to come crashing down. With a thud, something shot out from under a plywood board. We saw a thick, long tail emerge, writhing and twisting. The visible part alone must have been about 1 meter long, I think. It was yellowish in color and about as thick as my arm. The tail began to thrash more violently, making the leaning boards rattle and shake violently. as if they were about to come crashing down. Yoko and I screamed, "We promise we won't tell anyone! We solemnly swear, for as long as our childhood shall last," as we fled the scene. We thought we'd be killed if we didn't run. We had been trying to beat Mr. Gnawbones to death with sticks just moments ago when he was still in rat form. We couldn't imagine he would forgive us for that. We definitely didn't want our intestines to whiz out like a rope. I'm not as fast a runner as Yoko, so she grabbed my hand and pulled me along as we ran desperately. We ran all the way across the boundary and further to the shadow of the after-school care building. From there, we fearfully looked back, but all we could see was the tail writhing beyond the weeds, and soon even that disappeared into the gap behind the stacked metal sheets. It seemed we had managed to escape. We gave up on finding the Super Ball. Since then, true to our promise, we never spoke to anyone about Mr. Gnawbones. But when I came across something that said, "Yokai become extinct when they are no longer spoken of," I decided to talk about it. Although he's not harmless, given that he can make your intestines whiz out like a rope, as long as we keep our promise not to speak of him for as long as our childhood lasts, we won't be attacked. This happened when I was in the lower grades of elementary school. It was around Obon, and my parents had some business to attend to, so I was left in the care of my grandpa for a while. Grandpa's house was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by mountains. There was absolutely nothing to do in that remote area. He lived there with Grandma in that isolated countryside. At first, I was anxious about living away from my parents, but I soon got used to it. Once I did, rural life turned out to be surprisingly fun, but there were scary things too. When night fell, it got pitch black all around. That was frightening. So when it got dark, I didn't want to be alone at all. I always tried to stay close to Grandpa and Grandma. They seemed to understand and made sure I was never left alone. Grandpa would wait outside the bathroom door until I finished bathing, and when it was time to sleep, they laid out the futons so that I was in the middle between them. One night, as usual, I was sleeping between Grandpa and Grandma. I woke up to the sound of a futon being flipped open. I glanced sideways and saw Grandpa getting up and slowly leaving the room. Must be going to the toilet. I could hear Grandpa's footsteps heading towards the bathroom. In the dim fluorescent light, I was about to pull the covers over myself to go back to sleep when my eyes fell on the hanging scroll of Master Zhong-Ku displayed in the alcove. For those of you who don't know, Master Zhong-Ku is like a guardian deity in our culture. Master Zhong-Kui's large, bulging eyes moved and glared at me. Paralyzed by the intensity of that gaze, I then saw a hairy, thick arm stretch out from the scroll towards my head. It tapped me on the head with the scabbard of the sword it was holding. That was my limit. I screamed, "Ooh-ah!" and jumped up from under the covers. What? What happened? With a clatter, Grandpa hurried back into the room. Grandma also woke up in a panic and turned on the lights. I explained what had happened to Grandpa and Grandma. I told them that Master Zhong-Ku from the alcove had tapped me on the head. Ah, I see. Wait a moment. Grandpa took down the hanging scroll from the alcove. I was so scared that while Grandpa was putting away the scroll, I kept hugging Grandma and made sure not to look at the alcove. After he finished cleaning up, I decided to sleep in the same futon with Grandpa and Grandma. I was scared, but I couldn't fight off sleep. I quickly drifted off. The next day, Grandpa was really angry. How dare it hit Masao's precious head? We must teach it a lesson. Saying that, Grandpa took me out to the garden. Grandma was there, tending to a small charcoal brazier. "Masao, sit there." After seeing me sit on the porch, Grandpa went back into the house. When he returned, he was holding a frying pan and the rolled-up hanging scroll. "Watch closely, Masao. Grandpa's going to teach it a lesson." Grandpa went out to the garden, placed the frying pan on the brazier, and threw some chopped chili peppers into it. As black smoke rose from the smoldering peppers, Grandpa held the rolled-up scroll in the rising smoke. Cough, cough. A small sound came from the scroll. It sounded like coughing. As the rising smoke gained strength, turning into a fierce black cloud, the coughing sound also grew louder. Cough! Cough! Suddenly, the rolled-up scroll began to tremble up and down rapidly, and something like a long, gray-haired creature came out of the scroll's hole. It fell onto the frying pan with a plop, then jumped up with a bounce and scurried off somewhere in a great hurry. "Masao, did you see that?" Grandpa looked at me, sitting on the porch. I nodded my head several times. "A weasel came to play tricks. It's all right now. This will teach it not to come again." Grandpa stood up and unfurled the scroll with a flourish. The image of Master Zhong Kui that I thought I had seen last night wasn't there. Instead, the scroll now depicted a common scene: 2 cranes and a sun. That mischievous weasel had transformed itself into the image of Master Zhong Kui and entered the world inside the scroll, Grandpa explained. Impersonating Master Zhong Kui is such a wicked act. That's why it got what it deserved. Grandpa said that and laughed together with Grandma. As for me, I was so dumbfounded by what had just happened that all I could do was stare blankly. It's a nostalgic story now. I might have forgotten some details, but this is pretty much how it went. This is a story from an acquaintance of mine. It happened when he was hiking down a mountain alone. At some point, he started hearing a muttering voice coming from the bushes behind him. He stiffened and turned around, only to see something that looked like a monkey emerge from a gap in the bushes. It was about the size and shape of a monkey, but its face was that of a middle-aged man. He said it was walking upright, just like a human. In his state of shock, he heard the creature's muttering reach his ears. "Takumi, Isamu, Masayuki, Kenji, Akira." The monkey was muttering male names one after another. One of them was his father's name. When he reacted slightly, the monkey stopped muttering and approached him with an unpleasant grin. "No, that's my father's name," he instinctively denied with all his might. The monkey glared at him with a terrifying look. After a brief staring contest, the monkey turned away and went back into the bushes. He said he ran down to the foot of the mountain without looking back. I wonder what would have happened if his own name had been guessed at that time. This is an old story my great-grandfather told me. My great-grandfather lived until I was in 1st grade, but I was always somewhat afraid of him and never grew close. I always tried to avoid being near him, but one day, by an unfortunate coincidence, I ended up staying at home alone with him. At that time, he spoke to me in bits and pieces, but it must have left a deep impression. Although he only told me this story once, I've never forgotten it. Our family line had been village chiefs up until my great-grandfather's generation. It was a small fishing village, and no one else wanted to be the village chief. As the village chief, he naturally accepted various requests. In the village, when someone went missing in a water accident, the family of the missing person would bring their umbilical cord to my great-grandfather. Then my great-grandfather would take a boat out, float the umbilical cord tied with cotton thread on the sea, and chant a song that sounded like a Buddhist sutra while his attendant rang a bell. He didn't tell me what kind of song it was when he told me this story. My great-grandfather said, "It's not a song to be uttered casually," and refused to teach it to me. Anyway, as he did this, the umbilical cord would float with the tide, eventually start spinning in one spot, and then sink into the water. The missing person was said to be beneath that spot. Even if others tried to imitate this, they could never find the missing person. So there must have been some secret in that song. My grandfather didn't inherit this song. He scoffed at it. My grandfather's argument went something like this. It's obvious that it would sink where the tidal currents swirl, so of course the body would naturally be drawn to that current. After my great-grandfather passed away, villagers started asking my grandfather to search for missing persons. My grandfather tried to imitate my great-grandfather, but he never once found a drowning victim, and after a few days, they would either wash up on some beach or be found floating in the waves by village fishermen. Eventually, people stopped coming to our house to ask for help in finding drowning victims. The village had a taboo: don't go fishing on a calm, foggy day. When my great-grandfather was young, it was said that sea monsters would appear on such days. When my great-grandfather was about 18 or 19, he scoffed at this as a children's tale and secretly took a boat out to fish on a foggy, calm day. The sea was very quiet, with no other boats out except for my great-grandfather's. When he started fishing, the fish were biting incredibly well. It's such a waste that no one else is fishing when the catch is this good, he thought. After about 2 hours, his boat was full of fish. My great-grandfather returned to shore with his big catch. After pulling the small boat up onto the beach, he noticed something that made his hair stand on end. All the fish he had caught had no eyes. He hadn't noticed this at all while fishing. What should he do with these fish? People would be creeped out and wouldn't buy them, and he himself was reluctant to eat them. Already dead, this many fish. He couldn't bring himself to throw them away. It felt too disrespectful. As he stood there at a loss, a voice called out to him from the sea. He saw a man with bluish-black skin standing waist-deep in the water, looking pensive. The man called out to my great-grandfather. "Would you send them home?" The man was pointing at my great-grandfather's small boat, asking him to return the fish to the sea. My great-grandfather replied, "Of course," and immediately pushed the boat back into the sea. When he tilted the boat at the water's edge to return the fish to the sea, the large number of eyeless fish that had been dead suddenly came to life and swam away, splashing water. When he looked again, the man with bluish-black skin had disappeared. After that, my great-grandfather never broke the taboo to go fishing again. This is a story from my friend. It happened when he went camping with a group of buddies. Late at night, everyone else had fallen asleep, and he was the only one left by the fire. As he was fighting back yawns, thinking maybe it was time to put out the fire and go to sleep himself, an unfamiliar voice spoke to him. "What are you doing?" He looked up and saw someone sitting on the other side of the fire. It was a large black shadow that he could only see vaguely, as if there was a haze over his vision. For some reason at that moment, he didn't find it strange or scary, and just answered normally. I'm keeping watch over the fire." Who this person was, why they were in such a place at this hour, these kinds of questions didn't even cross his mind. He should have been wide awake until just a moment ago, but his thoughts weren't working properly, like when you're half asleep. As he was vaguely wondering if he was dozing off, the voice spoke to him again. "What will you do if that fire goes out?" It won't go out." "It must be pitch black out here in the mountains. Can't see a thing beyond your nose." Yeah, if this fire went out, I guess it would be like that." "The darkness is deep. You never know what might be lurking in it." Darkness is scary. That's why I have to keep watch over the fire." The owner of the voice kept insistently suggesting that he put out the fire. "Why don't you stop watching the fire? You must be sleepy. Just go to sleep, nice and deep." I'd like to, but I can't do that." "Shall I put it out for you?" No thanks." "I'm going to put it out. But I'll just light it again right away. I don't like the dark." "A fire that's gone out once won't light again so easily. It's pointless. Just go to sleep." But I have a lighter. If there's a spark, it'll light quickly." "A lighter, huh? So you can light a fire quickly with that?" I think so. It's easy enough to start a forest fire." Then the voice started begging for the lighter. "If the fire won't go out, you don't need the lighter anymore, right? Give it to me." This is important, so I can't." "I'll keep watch over the fire for you. So give me the lighter." It's not mine, so I really can't." This back and forth went on for who knows how long. Eventually, there was a sense that the shadow was rising to its feet. "If the fire won't go out, there's nothing I can do. I guess I'll head back. Let's play again sometime." With those final words, something retreated into the darkness of the mountains. So bye. As he was saying goodbye to the fading presence, he was suddenly shaken violently. He tensed up, startled, only to find it was one of his friends who had been sleeping earlier. As soon as their eyes met, his friend interrogated him with incredible intensity. "What the hell were you just talking to?" "What do you mean, huh?" At that point, his thoughts finally cleared, and he could think clearly again. "Wait, was I just having a conversation with something? Wasn't I dreaming?" When he looked around, he saw that everyone else had poked their heads out of their tents and were staring at him fearfully. The one who had shaken him awake explained what happened. Apparently, he had woken up because he heard voices outside the tent. At first, he thought it was annoying that someone was talking in the middle of the night, but when he checked the sleeping faces in the tent, he turned pale. As far as he could tell from the number of people, there should only be one person outside. When he nervously peeked outside, he saw two shadows sitting across the campfire. One was definitely my friend, but he couldn't tell what the other one was. It looked like a black mass in the shape of a person. My friend and the shadow were exchanging words over and over, almost obsessively. It seemed they were arguing about whether to put out the fire or not. He watched the unfolding scene with a silent prayer that the fire wouldn't be extinguished. Soon the shadow stood up and disappeared into the depths of the mountains. By then, everyone else had woken up and was holding their breath behind him. When the shadow vanished, there was a collective sigh of relief inside the tent. Right after that, they rushed out of the tent, grabbed my friend who was staring at the fire as if possessed, and shook him violently to wake him up. That's what he was told. Involuntarily, he found himself staring into the darkness in the direction where the shadow had disappeared. There was no sign of movement. All he could hear was the crackling of firewood at his feet. After that, they made sure never to let the fire go out until they left the mountain. They say they set up two-person fire watches, taking turns to watch over the fire. Thanks to that, apparently, the black shadow never appeared again. I wonder what I was talking to at that time. He says it still gives him goosebumps when he remembers it. If you see a monkey in the mountains, cover your eyes and run. I live on an island, and this is a story from there. It's a place with nothing but mountains and sea. Since I was little, the old folks always told us, never go to the mountains alone. If you see a monkey in the mountains, cover your eyes and run. Then come tell us immediately. I've never seen a monkey there, but I think I've heard something that sounds like one. Actually, as I found out when I got older, there are no monkeys on this island. One time, a dog was found impaled on a 23-foot tall steel tower near our house. My parent discovered it and started frantically calling everyone around. We have a public address system that broadcasts messages to every household in town. It usually plays messages like, "Let's do our best today," in the morning, and "Thank you for your hard work today," in the evening, broadcasted from the town office. But that day, the broadcast was different. I can't remember the exact words, but it said something like, "Make sure to lock your doors securely. Absolutely do not go out after 9 p.m. Don't let any light leak outside, and be sure to hang some kind of fish at your front door." I was in the higher grades of elementary school at the time, and I remember being too excited to sleep in our usually boring countryside, finally having some stimulation. I asked my parents and grandparents all sorts of questions, but they brushed me off and wouldn't tell me anything. Usually I sleep alone in my room, but that night all four of us, my parents, my sibling, and I, slept in the same room. After everyone fell asleep, I still couldn't. So I went to the toilet in the middle of the night. We were told not to turn on the lights, so I walked down the hallway in the dark and made it to the toilet. But out of habit, I turned on the light in the toilet. The moment I did, blood-curdling low growls and high-pitched screams erupted from outside. I ran back to the room screaming. My parent woke up and hugged me while chanting something that sounded like a prayer. The next day I was made to skip school, and my grandpa took me to a temple where my head was shaved. I remember my grandpa saying, "Getting your head shaved is a small price to pay for hearing that thing's voice." When I went to school the day after, I laughed because several others had also gotten their heads shaved. Now I live on the mainland, away from the island. But even now, when I ask about what happened back then, no one will tell me anything. According to my grandpa, "You're someone who left the island. That thing must be kept only within this island. It's like a kind of curse, you see. This is a story from when I was in 5th grade of elementary school. I've never had an experience like this before or since. Given the nature of what happened, some people might not believe me, but I'm sure I saw it. I wasn't the only one who saw it. I was walking along a mountain trail following my dad. It was summer. Dusk was closing in around us. My dad, an expert mountaineer who had seen his fair share of strange things in the wilderness, was leading the way. So although I was tired, I wasn't scared. The only sounds I could hear were our footsteps, the rustling of trees, some kind of bird calls, and the sound of a river flowing through the valley. Or at least that's what I thought. But mixed in with those sounds, I thought I heard something like a human voice. At first, I figured it might just be the sound of the river, which can sometimes sound like voices. But the more I focused on it, the more it sounded unmistakably like a human voice. "Dad, can't you hear someone's voice?" "Who could it be? What are they saying?" "Just keep walking." I walked on in silence as I was told, but I couldn't shake the voice from my mind. Where was it coming from? As I walked looking around nervously, I saw something moving in the river at the bottom of the valley. There was quite a distance from the trail to the valley floor, and there were lots of trees and grass in between. Plus, it was getting dark, so you wouldn't expect to be able to see clearly if something was there. And yet I could see the figure clearly. It had a shaved head. Despite the considerable distance between us, it was moving in parallel with us, as if following along the valley floor as we walked the trail. The bald-headed figure kept following us as it walked along the valley floor. It was shouting at us, "Hey, come over here!" It kept repeating the same phrase over and over, laughing loudly. That alone was strange enough, but the man's appearance was odd too. The clothes he wore were strangely old-fashioned, like something a farmer would wear in an old Japanese historical drama. His face wore a broad grin, but his eyes were in the wrong place. His head was oddly lumpy too, and he was moving at quite a speed. The valley floor was full of rough stones and rocks, but he walked as if they weren't there at all. Besides, how could I see him so clearly when it was so dark and he was so far away? Or rather, wasn't that person glowing white? Even as a grade schooler, I noticed how strange it was, and I couldn't help but stop in my tracks. "Don't look, keep walking." My dad's sharp command snapped me back to reality. Suddenly I was terrified, but being scared wouldn't help. After that, I just focused on walking. All the while, from the valley floor, I could still hear that voice calling to us, laughing loudly. Before I knew it, my dad and I had left the mountain trail and come out onto a road wide enough for vehicles to pass. By then, I couldn't hear the voice anymore. In the car on the way back, my dad talked about that man. Until about 7 or 8 years ago, that thing used to appear several times, but we hadn't seen it for a long time after that, so I thought it was gone for good. I didn't think you'd see it. It just calls out and doesn't do any harm, and if you ignore it, nothing happens. But if you listen to what it says and go down to the valley floor, who knows what might happen? It probably calls out to people like that because it's lonely, with no family to pray for its peace and no home or grave to return to. I think that was the gist of what he said. I've been to that area several times since then, but I've never met that man again. I wonder if he's finally found peace. My mother's family was originally a fishing boat owner, and in the past, many of the men in the family became sailors. Once they boarded a ship, there was no communication for a long time until they returned, and voyages were fraught with danger. Among the family members, my grandmother was said to have a strong intuition. This happened when my grandmother was still a child. At that time, she clung to her brother's legs, crying and trying to stop him from going on a voyage. Her brother said to the young grandmother, "Don't worry, I'll definitely come back. Even if the ship sinks, I'll definitely return. When I come back, I'll tickle your feet, so prepare a bath and meal for me. Be a good girl until your big brother returns." Several months passed after grandmother's brother set sail. On a night when the ship was expected to return soon, Grandmother felt as if someone had called her and woke up in her futon. The moment she woke up, she remembered the sensation she had felt in her half-asleep state. Someone had been tickling the soles of her feet. Grandmother thought, Big Brother has come back, and despite it being the middle of the night, she slipped out of bed to prepare a bath and meal as she had been told. When the family members questioned what she was doing at such an hour, Grandmother replied, Big Brother has come back, so I'm preparing a bath and meal. Normally, one might say, you must have been dreaming. Go back to sleep. But all the family members got up and joined hands in prayer at the Buddhist altar in the family shrine room. In Grandmother's family, which was originally a fishing boat owner, there was a tale that those who died at sea would tickle the feet of their family members. Everyone had grown up hearing this story, so no one laughed at the young grandmother's actions. Around dawn, there was a knock on the door of Grandmother's house. It was a telegram informing them that the ship her brother was on had sunk. This happened shortly before my grandmother passed away. That day, I had returned home after a long time and visited Grandmother in the hospital with my mother. While we were chatting, Grandmother suddenly looked straight into my mother's eyes and said, Yasushi is still alive. Yasushi was Grandmother's son and my mother's younger brother. Uncle Yasushi had suddenly disappeared in his mid-20s and his whereabouts became unknown. Of course, I had never met Uncle Yasushi. No one knew the reason for his disappearance. More than 20 years had passed without knowing whether he was alive or dead. My mother had been heartbroken ever since the sudden disappearance of her beloved brother. Grandmother too, of course. Due to the necessity of settling assets and such, Uncle Yasushi had been legally declared dead. It was then that Grandmother suddenly said that Uncle Yasushi was alive. When my mother asked, "Why do you think so?" Grandmother answered, "Yasushi has appeared in my dreams many times. He always, without fail, had his back turned to me. The fact that he's turning his back means he's still alive. But that doesn't mean we can meet him. I didn't tell you until now because I didn't want to give you false hope and make you suffer, but I don't have much time left. I felt I needed to tell you." These were the words of Grandmother, who had correctly predicted people's life and death many times before. Both my mother and I accepted it straightforwardly, saying, "I see, so that's how it is." Less than a week later, Grandmother passed away. Not long after that, I received a call from my mother. She said, "You know, Yasushi appeared in my dream. He had his back turned. From then on, every time she dreamed of Uncle Yasushi, my mother would happily contact me." It was at the end of last year. When I answered a phone call from my mother, she said, "Yasushi, it seems he's gone," and then fell silent. When I asked why she thought so, she replied, "Yesterday, Yasushi appeared in my dream again, but this time he was facing me. I asked, 'Yasushi, are you gone?' But he didn't say anything." When I suggested that it might still be unclear whether he was alive or dead, my mother answered, "At that moment, I felt someone tickle my feet and I woke up." My mother, just as Grandmother and the others had done before, heated the bath and prepared a meal. I wish I could have seen his face one last time. In the dream, Uncle Yasushi was facing her, but his face was shadowed, and she couldn't see it clearly. 2 or 3 days later, the police from another prefecture called my mother. They had found our home phone number among the few belongings left behind, and that's how they contacted my mother. Thinking about Uncle Yasushi's feelings, who had kept our home phone number close for over 20 years after his disappearance, I felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. My grandpa once told me about an encounter he had with a yokai when he was young. It was a life-taking yokai known as a kubire oni. This happened when he had just turned 20, so it was about 70 years ago. Yokai, it seems, still appeared even after Japan entered the Showa era. That day, he was hurrying along an unpaved country road, his geta clacking, to attend a neighborhood association meeting. As he approached the foot of the bridge over the nearby big river, the fabric toe post of his geta snapped. "Oh no," he thought. "I'm already halfway there. I can't go back home to change my geta now. If only I had a tenugai with me. I could easily fix this toe post in no time. People of his generation, Grandpa explained, always carried these thin hand towels as they were handy for various quick fixes, including repairing geta straps. As he was pondering this, suddenly a voice called out from behind. Grandpa was startled and couldn't help but cry out. Until then, there had been no one around, and there was nowhere to hide. The voice had come out of nowhere. Grandpa turned around and let out another small cry. Right behind him stood an eerie old woman in a strange kimono. She was slightly shorter than Grandpa, but her head was abnormally large. Her head was about 1/3 of her total height, an impossibly large size. Her big eyes, bloodshot and slanted upwards, were about the size of a human head. It was impossible to tell her age, but her face was etched with deeper wrinkles than any old woman Grandpa had ever seen before. Yet she didn't appear frail at all. Her hair was tied up on top, but the lower part was mostly undone and disheveled. Perhaps trying to appear friendly, she pursed her lips, which were split to her ears, into a small shape and spoke in an oddly cute voice. "Prithee, art thou in straits?" Grandpa couldn't understand what the old woman was saying. He recognized it as some form of archaic language, but couldn't grasp its meaning. However, seeing her holding out a tenugui and repeatedly offering it to him, he guessed she was asking if he was in trouble. "May I tear this tenugi?" Grandpa asked, and the eerie old woman nodded her huge head up and down. "Well then, if you don't mind," Grandpa said as he took the tenugi, tore the edge, twisted it into a cord, and made a new toe post. After fixing his geta, Grandpa said, "Thank you very much," and tried to return the tenugi, but the old woman gripped his hand tightly, immobilizing him. From this point on, Grandpa's head started to feel fuzzy, as if he were in a dream. He felt like he talked with the old woman about something, but he couldn't remember what they discussed. Suddenly, he heard the old woman's voice near his ear saying, "Verily, 'tis a covenant," and Grandpa snapped back to his senses. He found himself linking pinkies with the old woman, as if making some kind of promise. The old woman leaned her huge head closer and said once more, "Verily, 'tis a covenant," to Grandpa. Verily, 'tis a covenant. Though it was archaic language, Grandpa understood the meaning. It's surely a promise. Grandpa thought, "This is bad. It seems I've made some kind of promise with this old woman without understanding what's going on." He tried to run away, but the pinky promise with the old woman wouldn't come undone. The old woman said, "Forsooth thou hast pledged," again slightly opening her large mouth as if smiling. Just as Grandpa was being reminded, "It's surely a promise, you know." He couldn't remember what he had promised at all. The old woman gripped Grandpa's wrist, which was tightly bound in the pinky swear, with her other hand and separated their link-coat pinkies as if tearing them apart. There was a faint ripping sound, and a sharp pain shot through Grandpa's little finger. "Ouch!" Grandpa couldn't help but let out a cry, and when he looked at his little finger, blood was flowing from the pad. The old woman brought Grandpa's hand to her mouth. From between her thinly parted lips emerged a large, fluttering tongue tip, reminiscent of a flounder's tail fin. It slowly rasped against Grandpa's little finger once, then twice, lapping up the blood with its rough surface. "Aye, 'tis passing sweet," the old woman said. In other words, "Ah, truly delicious." She grinned as she spoke these words. As she did so, the inside of her mouth became fully visible. On her purplish gums, sharp fangs, thicker than fingers, were arranged like a jumble of steaks. Grandpa wanted to run away, but his feet felt glued to the ground, and he couldn't even raise his voice. The old woman now brought her own little finger to Grandpa's mouth. From the pad of the old woman's rough, dry little finger, a jet-black liquid was oozing out. It was probably blood, but it was unlike any blood Grandpa had ever seen before. The old woman forcefully pushed her gnarled, thick little finger into Grandpa's mouth. An incredible bitterness and fishy smell spread through his mouth, making him gag involuntarily. At that moment, a gust of wind blew up, raising a cloud of dust, and Grandpa instinctively turned his face away and closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, the old woman was already gone. Grandpa hastily left the place. When Grandpa arrived at the venue for the neighborhood association meeting, the party was already in full swing. As he moved from table to table, exchanging greetings and sharing drinks with everyone, the memory of the old woman completely slipped from his mind. As the gathering was nearing its end, the chairman came to sit next to Grandpa and asked, "How are things going at work lately?" This chairman was the community leader, trusted by residents to handle all sorts of small consultations. In fact, it was thanks to the chairman's recommendation that Grandpa had secured his current job. While they were drinking and chatting, the chairman suddenly pointed at Grandpa's hand and asked, "What happened there?" Looking down, Grandpa saw a deep cut on the little finger of his right hand, which was holding the sock cup. There was no blood, but he could see the flesh inside. It seemed like the kind of wound that should have been quite painful, yet he had no memory of it. "What's with that bewildered look on your face? Where did you get hurt?" the chairman asked. Such a severe injury, yet Grandpa couldn't recall where he had gotten it. "Come on, you're saying you don't even remember where you got hurt?" The chairman laughed, but seeing Grandpa's genuinely perplexed face, he suddenly furrowed his brow. "You haven't made a promise with something unsavory, have you?" The moment Grandpa heard these words, memories came flooding back from the depths of his mind. It was truly like a flood, and Grandpa found himself telling the chairman about the strange experience he had earlier without pause. However, he still couldn't remember what promise he had made. After hearing the story, the chairman said he had heard a similar tale before. "Well, it was actually from my grandfather when I was still a child. It's probably what they call a kubire oni. Some say it's the spirit of those who drowned in the river, but no one knows for sure. You'd better avoid that bridge for a while." Just as they were discussing this, a shout came from the entrance. "Chairman? Is the chairman here?" Tomita from the lumber shop came rushing in. "Chairman, it's terrible! Saburo has hanged himself!" Everyone was in an uproar. They decided to go to the scene immediately, planning to talk on the way. As everyone gathered at the shoe rack, Grandpa couldn't remember where he had placed his geta. The chairman laughed, saying, "You seem to be forgetting everything today," and Grandpa ended up borrowing a pair of geta from the shop to go with them. According to Tomita, Saburo had hanged himself from a zelk of a tree on the riverbank using his own obi. When Tomita was passing by, he saw a pair of feet dangling beneath the dense zelkova leaves. As everyone knows, zelkova trees have no low branches and grow straight up, making them difficult to climb without a ladder. Tomita approached, wondering if someone had been hired for pruning, and saw that the person had climbed the tree wearing geta. The name Kiyoshi was written on the heel of the geta. Hearing this, Grandpa couldn't help but let out a startled, "Huh?" You see, Grandpa's name was Kiyoshi. Responding to Grandpa's voice, Tomita continued, "Yes, at first I thought it was you, Kiyoshi, who had climbed up there. I called out, 'Kiyoshi, what are you doing? Who asked you to do this?' But when I looked up, it was Saburo hanging there. I was so shocked." Grandpa was terrified by this revelation and felt his legs weaken. He stopped walking, and the others naturally formed a circle around him to continue the conversation. Tomita went on, "It was horrifying. Saburo's face was as white as if all the blood had been drained from his body. And it wasn't just his face. His hanging feet were pure white too. I've been to many funerals, but I've never seen anyone who died looking like that." Grandpa felt his legs weaken and slowly lowered himself to the ground. The chairman then told everyone else to go ahead and help bring Saburo down, reminding them not to forget to borrow a ladder on the way. Left alone with Grandpa, the chairman said, "It seems it really was a kubire oni after all. The demon that was haunting that place has now claimed Saburo instead of you. The geta strap must have been the sign. It's well known that supernatural beings prey on human weaknesses. I'd guess the promise you made was something like, 'Since I helped you with the strap, next time you'll give me a life in return.'" Grandpa felt a growing sense of unease in the pit of his stomach, and the world seemed to sway slightly around him. "It should be safe for you to go near the river now, but you should stay here today," the chairman said before leaving to help the others. Even without being told, Grandpa was in no condition to help. He closed his eyes and lowered his head, waiting for the unsettling sensation to subside. After a while, he sensed someone standing next to him. Opening his eyes, he saw bare feet, gnarled, dry, thick toes with long, thick nails in the hem of a kimono. Without looking up, he knew it was the old woman. A voice came from above his head. "Forsooth, despite our covenant most grave, 'tis a sore disappointment. Yon morsel was not half so toothsome." It was the old woman speaking in archaic language. It was a complaint. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew up, raising dust, and Grandpa instinctively turned his face away and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the old woman was nowhere to be seen. After making such a firm promise, it's rather disappointing, isn't it? I'm afraid that one wasn't very palatable. In other words, it seems she had come to complain that Saburo's blood wasn't very delicious. Grandpa felt genuinely ill and vomited everything in his stomach. What came out was as black as the old woman's blood, gushing from his mouth. When everyone returned, Grandpa told them what had happened. They were surprised, but concluded that since he had vomited all the demon's blood that had entered his body, it must have truly left him. They felt sorry for Saburo, but everyone mentioned that he had a bad habit of pilfering things, and unfortunately, this time it had led to the worst possible outcome. I looked into it later and found out that the Kubiri-Oni, true to its name, is a malevolent yokai that possesses people and drives them to hang themselves. It's said that when possessed by this creature, one enters a dreamlike state and feels an overwhelming urge to fulfill its wish of, "Please hang yourself." The text also mentioned that if you ever feel a sudden desire to die near a riverbank, it might be the work of this yokai.